Today we are talking about the ABCs of ancient history, and we will be talking about 26 figures, both mythological and real, who created great impacts in ancient history. With A, we have Alexander the Great, who was a conqueror from Macedonia. One that I thought would be a good comparison to him was King Xerxes of the Persian Empire. And some of the ways they were the same and kind of differed were that they were both great conquerors who conquered much of the Middle East and Asia. Alexander was never married, and Xerxes was quite a few times. Alexander died at a young age, and Xerxes did not. My evaluation of the comparisons between them were that Alexander was one of the first great conquerors to try and unite Asia. He paved the way for future conquerors to rule over the landmass of Asia. With B, we have Buddha, a holy man originally born in Nepal, and I decided to compare him to Jesus Christ. Jesus taught that the way to be saved from sin was faith, and Buddha taught that one should reach nirvana. He did not believe in sin. Well, he did, but not in the way that Christians think it. They both taught that peace was a good thing, and while Jesus said that there was a God, Buddha said that there was no God. My evaluation of them was that Buddha began Buddhism, which is one of the biggest religions that has continued to this day. He advocated for peace and unity, not war and strife. Cleopatra was an Egyptian queen. My comparison for her was Queen Theodora of the Holy Roman Empire. Queen Theodora was a Christian and Cleopatra was not. Theodora was from the Holy Roman Empire and Cleopatra was from Egypt. Theodora was an actress turned empress, and Cleopatra had had her power since birth. The deal with being an actress in the Holy Roman Empire was that it wasn't exactly a very good occupation to have. Didn't have the prestige that acting has nowadays. My evaluation of them was that Cleopatra was one of the greatest Egyptian queens who ruled strongly over all of Upper and Lower Egypt. She was a powerful influence on some of the early Roman emperors, such as Julius Caesar. D, I chose Djoser, the ancient Egyptian pharaoh. I decided to compare him to Cleopatra. They were both viewed as gods by the people, and they were also both very strong rulers who made sure that nothing really bad happened during their time, other than Cleopatra having a few flings with Roman emperors. You can edit that out. They're both Egyptians, and the evaluation was that even though Djoser is one of the lesser known kings of Egypt, he is one of the more powerful ones. He was one of the first pharaohs to instigate the belief that pharaohs were gods. With E, I chose Edward the Confessor, who was one of the ancient kings of England. I compared him to William the Conqueror, and although William was not pious in the least, Edward was. William was a rival of Edward's for the throne of England, and they had a huge war over it. William was a ruthless leader, and Edward was a nice one who was kind of people. My evaluation of them was that Edward was one of the more peaceful kings of England before greed began to seep into the monarchy. He was a godly ruler who tried to rule England according to God's will. This meant that England did not become a secular nation early on. With F, we got Flavius Arcadius, an ancient Roman emperor. My comparison was to Theodosius the First, and the deal with Theodosius was that he was a strong ruler, while Flavius was not. Theodosius was not a Christian, and Flavius was. Theodosius was a social and popular king, and Flavius was antisocial and unpopular, partially because of his religion. My evaluation of them was that though Flavius was an unpopular ruler, he was a Christian, which did help his ability to rule the Roman Empire morally. However, since he tried to stay out of the public as much as possible, he did not have a very good influence on his empire. With G, we have Galen, who was an ancient Greek physician, and my comparison to him was Soranus of Ephesus. They had different schools of thought in medicine, which my next point ties onto that, which was Soranus rejected use of anatomy and dissection and instead just treated the symptoms of the diseases rather than the diseases themselves. Soranus also believed in keeping medicinal rules simple rather than complex like Galen's area. My evaluation was that Galen is known as the father of modern medicine, and for good reason, as he began figuring out the true causes of illnesses and diseases. With H, we got Hammurabi, an ancient Babylonian king, and my comparison to him was Moses. And Hammurabi put together his code of laws that were flawed, while Moses received his commandments from God. They were both powerful leaders who led their nations, and Hammurabi was a Babylonian ruler, and Moses was an Israelite, more or less religious leader. My evaluation is that Hammurabi was one of the greatest Babylonian kings because he was the first to organize the pre-existing laws into a more organized and complete form. This led the way for other monarchs to begin writing down all their laws. With I, we got Inanna, who was an ancient Mesopotamian goddess. My comparison to her was Artemis, who was a Greek goddess. Inanna was a Mesopotamian goddess, and Artemis was a Grecian goddess. So, basically, restatement of my woman and my god, my edit this out, please. They are both goddesses of love and beauty, and they are both some of the less important goddesses. My evaluation was that Inanna was one of the greater goddesses of the Mesopotamians, as she was the goddess of love and beauty. These were important things to that culture, so she was quite popular to worship. Inanna also began the spiral of goddesses in other cultures that symbolized love and beauty. With J, we have Jesus Christ, which is Christian deity. And my comparison to him is Zeus. And while Jesus was a real person, Zeus was not. Jesus was part of the Trinity, and Zeus was a king of the gods. Zeus was a violent god who is often petty and selfish, and Jesus is not. My evaluation is that Jesus was the physical embodiment of God's work on earth. He paved the way for Christianity to become a religion. With K, we get Khufu, which was another ancient Egyptian king. They had quite a few of them. My comparison was to King Akhenaten of Egypt. Khufu was a strong ruler who ruled with an iron fist, and Akhenaten was not. Khufu was not a merciful ruler, and Akhenaten was. Khufu built large pyramids, and he and Akhenaten did not. Khufu was one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt, and he was also one of the most influential rulers of Egypt. He did great work on the pyramids, and he ruled with an iron fist. With L, we get Laozi, who was a Chinese philosopher. My comparison to him was Guanzong. Laozi was a man of religion, and Guan was one of politics. Guan was a tutor to a few of the Chinese emperors. Their sons, that is. Laozi and Guan did not agree with each other in real life. They did actually meet each other a few times, and it was not the best meeting, shall we say. Guan attempted to murder one of his pupils, and Laozi was non-murderer, period. My evaluation was that Laozi was the founder of a religion that has many followers nowadays, which is Taoism. He advocated for peace in a time strife with war. We get Mars. No, not the planet, the ancient Roman god. My comparison to him is Minerva. They were both gods of war, and Minerva was a goddess of the arts, and Mars was not. They were both Roman gods. My evaluation is that Mars was a warlike god who was known for being mischievous. He was also one of the major gods. With N, we get Nefertiti, who was one of the ancient queens of Egypt. My comparison to her is Teticheri. They were both queens of ancient Egypt, and they were both strong rulers in a time when male monarchs were the norm. Nefertiti was considered a goddess, and Teticheri was not. My evaluation is that Nefertiti is one of the more mysterious queens of Egypt, and not much is known about her. However, she was one of the first queens to be considered a goddess. With O, we get Olympias, who was the mother of Alexander the Great. A comparison to her was Eurydice. Olympias was a real person, and Eurydice was a mythological one. Olympias was a powerful and influential queen even after being divorced by her husband, and Eurydice was humble. Olympias was from Passaron, which is an area in Macedonia, and Eurydice was from Greece, which is below Macedonia. Evaluation is that Olympias, not the Olympias. Olympias was one of the greatest queens of Macedonia, in addition to a great mother, as proved by her son who did great things. With P, we get Plato, who was an ancient Greek philosopher. A comparison to him was Epicurus. I always have problems with that name. Plato was a student of Socrates, and Epicurus was a student of Democritus. Plato wanted strict social rules, and Epicurus wanted simple social rules. I still say there's an in-between point. Plato had his religious beliefs influence his work, and Epicurus had his scientific beliefs influence his work. My evaluation is that Plato was one of the first philosophers who actually made a name for himself with his logic. He began the process of logical thinking, and through said logic, and thought that logic was the basis of all things. Typo. Q. Quintilinus, who was a Roman rhetorician and literary critic. And my comparison is Cassius Severus, not Snape. Quintilinus was a student of Cicero, and Cassius was self-taught. Quintilinus was traditional with his rhetoric, and Cassius was one for newfangled ideas. Quintilinus's rhetoric was influenced by his religion. Oh boy. Was influenced by his religion. Cassius's rhetoric was influenced by the scientific ideas of the era. My evaluation is that Quintilinus was one of the first great rhetoricians of the ancient Rome, and although he was influenced by his pagan religion, he greatly improved logical thinking. We have now R, which stands for Romulus, who was the legendary founder of Rome. And my comparison to him is Numa Pompilius. And Romulus was not a real person, while Numa was. Romulus was very warlike, even to the point where he literally killed his brother when they got into a fight, and Numa was a pacifist. They were both kings of Rome when it was small. My evaluation of Romulus is that, according to some versions of Romulus's legend, he was a power-hungry maniac who killed his brother in the middle of a fight. He is also depicted as a kind ruler, so stories vary. Either way, he is one of the bigger legendary heroes. Next we have S, who stands for Socrates, which was the ancient Greek philosopher. My comparison to him is Gorgias. Socrates was a critic of the sophists, while Gorgias was actually a sophist. Socrates was one for reason and logic, and Gorgias was one for questioning everything. Socrates was killed for defending his ideas, and Gorgias defended himself to stay alive. My valuation is that, although Socrates was about as anti-Christian as many of the ancient Greeks, he did argue many logical points that were relevant to his era. He began a school to teach the Greek children the opposites of what the government wanted, and thus began his own set of followers. Next, we have T, which stands for Tiberius, yet another ancient Roman emperor. A comparison to him is Trajan. Tiberius ruled for 23 years, while Trajan ruled for 12 years. Roman emperors had a high tendency of dying in office, and not of natural causes. They were both great conquerors who expanded the Roman Empire, and while Tiberius was very secretive about his private life, Trajan was more sociable and thus more popular. My evaluation is that Tiberius was one of the minor emperors of the Roman Empire, yet he was also one of the major conquerors who expanded it. With U, we get Ur-Nammu, which was one of the ancient rulers of Samaria. Comparison to him is Sargon of Akkad. They were both kings of Samaria, and Ur-Nammu reigned for 17 years, and Sargon reigned for 27 years. They were both military kings, and my evaluation of them, of Ur-Nammu was that he was one of the lesser known kings of Samaria and one of the less documented ones, so little is known about him. Yet, it is known that he built the great ziggurat of Ur, as well as other orchards and gardens, which meant that he was one for a lot of building. With V, we get Vespasian, who was an ancient Roman emperor. My comparison to him was Nero. And while Vespasian was born in the lowest class and rose through the societal ranks, Nero was born to the imperial family and became emperor easily. Vespasian reigned for 10 years, and Nero reigned for 4, which ended in his suicide. Vespasian began a new era of family rule, and Nero ended his family's line with his death. My evaluation of Vespasian was that he was one of the better kings of Rome, and he was a great conqueror as well. He began a new family of emperors, and was a huge inspiration to the lower classes because he had started out as one of them. With W, we get William Wallace, who was a Scottish knight. My comparison to him is Anthony Beck, and they were both part of a nobility from birth. Wallace reigned for 7 years, and Beck was a bishop. A bishop was a Beck was a bishop for a good part of his life. Wallace was a warrior, and Beck was a pious church member. My evaluation is that Wallace is one of the best-known Scots from his time. He was an inspirational hero and an amazing tactical leader. He defended the Scots from being taken over by the English, and he has a nice piece of bagpipe music written after him. Next, we have X, which we get Xenophon, Greek military leader, philosopher, and historian. My comparison to him is Herodotus. Xenophon was born in Athens, and Herodotus was born in Halicarnassus. Yes, that's a mouthful. Xenophon was a military leader for nearly 7 years, and Herodotus was an official philosopher for about 40 years. Xenophon had great charisma that helped him to be a popular military leader, and Herodotus was very skeptical, which helped him to be good at discerning logic. My evaluation is that Xenophon was a short-range ruler, and yet he did much in his lifetime. He was popular with the people and was highly esteemed. This meant that he didn't meet much resistance with his people, and it left a positive impact on history. With Y, we have Yehuda HaNasi, who was a second century rabbi. My comparison to him was Rabbi Akiva. Yehuda was born to a rich family, and Akiva was born to a poor family. Yehuda reigned as head of the Sanhedrin for nearly 80 years, and Akiva reigned for about 40 years in Jerusalem as a rabbi. Yehuda was friends with at least one Roman emperor, and Akiva was a fierce hater of the Romans, somewhat like the Zealots. My evaluation of Yehuda was that he was slightly different from the rest of the rabbis. He was friends with Romans rather than hating them. Since the Romans hadn't been very kind to the Jews, this was highly unusual. And finally, we have Z, and we get Zeno of Elea, who was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. And my comparison to him was Euclid, who was a mathematician as well as philosopher. Zeno was born in Italy, and Euclid was born in Egypt. Zeno was a philosopher for nearly 60 years, and Euclid was a philosopher and math teacher for about 40 years. Zeno was a loyal and courageous person who stood up for his ideas, while Euclid was a thoughtful and elegant person who was more sedate about sharing his thoughts. I should have checked my grammar there. My evaluation is that even though Zeno was not exactly one of the big name philosophers, he was definitely an interesting man who was one of the earliest philosophers that got the philosophy ball rolling. Thank you for listening to my lecture on the ABCs of ancient history.